Welcome to Somnotales History. Tonight, we step inside the cold stone walls of medieval monasteries where silence wasn't peace, it was control. This isn't a tale of faith. It's a story of rules, rituals, and the quiet weight of obedience. This is the grim reality of medieval religious orders. Long before the sun had risen over the ancient countryside, a thick morning fog clung to the rolling hills like a slow exhale from the earth itself. The faintest light bled over the eastern horizon, brushing the silhouettes of crumbling towers and stone cloisters nestled between woods and farmlands. In the quiet space between night and day, the world of the monastery stirred. A bell sounded deep, hollow, and low, as if waking not just the monks within, but the land around them too. Its echo reached across moss-covered walls and weather-worn cobblestones, past rows of withered vineyards and silent prayer gardens, until it vanished into the mist beyond. Inside the abbey, tucked away in the corner of a forgotten king, a life moved slowly. Every moment followed the next with quiet purpose, as if the building itself had memorized a script long ago and merely performed it now, over and over again. Brother Elric, a man whose age had blurred the sharpness of his youth into something softer, rose from his straw mattress with the same deliberate pace he had used for decades. His breath hung faintly in the air. Winter was still weeks away, but the chill had already found its way through the cracks of stone and timber. He dressed silently, pulling on a coarse wool habit that scratched against his skin and smelled faintly of mildew. Around him, other monks stirred, shadows in brown robes moving like ghosts in the dim light. No one spoke. They had all taken the vow of silence for the season, an act of penance and focus, but even if they hadn't, there was little to say. Words had a way of losing meaning within those walls, diluted by the weight of ritual and repetition. The procession toward morning prayers began. Feet shuffled across cold stone, torches flickered weakly, and the sound of breathing mingled with the muffled hum of chanting in the distance. As the brothers moved deeper into the nave of the church, candlelight revealed faces worn by years of fasting and contemplation. Their eyes, dulled by countless hours staring at the same stone floors, avoided one another's gaze. In that place, to be seen was to be noticed, and to be noticed was to invite curiosity, something rarely welcomed within the cloister. Elric knelt with the others, the bones of his knees pressing into the cold flagstone. He closed his eyes. The chants began, low and monotone, and filled the vast hall with their rhythm. Latin syllables fell like snow, each word adding to a blanket of sound that muffled thought and dulled sensation. That was the point, he supposed, to forget oneself, to become something smaller, a tool, a vessel, an instrument of devotion. But behind his closed eyelids, Elric did not see holy light or divine wisdom. He saw a flicker of something else, memory, perhaps, or regret. A fire once lit behind his ribs that had long since become little more than embers. He had not always been a monk. Few of them had. Some arrived by choice, others by force. A debt paid, a punishment endured, a family spared disgrace. Elric's path had been quiet, unassuming. He had simply walked away from a world that no longer wanted him. Or maybe he had been the one who turned away first. It hardly mattered anymore. As the prayers ended and the monks dispersed in silence, he found himself drifting, not just through the halls, but through memories that clung like ivy to the back of his mind. The monastery, ancient and isolated, had a way of consuming the present. Time moved differently there, like water trapped in a slow, meandering pool. Outside, the world changed. Kings rose and fell, battles were fought and forgotten, seasons turned, but inside, it was always the same hour, the same day, the same year. They worked in the fields that morning, tilling hardened soil and tending to withered rows of vegetables that refused to thrive in the dying light of autumn. The work was hard, and the rewards were few, but to suffer was to earn grace, or so the abbots claimed. Elric had heard the phrase so many times he no longer knew what it meant. Pain had become ordinary. Hunger was a companion. Fatigue was a kind of prayer in itself. Nearby, Brother Godric labored in silence, his face hidden beneath the hood of his robe. Godric had once been a nobleman, proud and sharp-eyed, with fingers unused to toil, but that was years ago. Now, his hands were calloused and his shoulders stooped. Pride, like so much else, had been worn down by time and obedience. Elric had often wondered what had brought the man to such a place. He never asked. No one did. They were not encouraged to speak of the past, not even to themselves. As the sun reached its peak, they returned to the cloister to share a meager meal of bread and thin stew. Silence still ruled, broken only by the occasional clatter of a wooden bowl or the creak of old benches. The refectory was dim and cold, lit only by narrow windows that let in pale slivers of gray daylight. Elric sat across from a young novice, named Thomas, whose hands trembled slightly as he dipped bread into his bowl. The boy was not yet used to the rhythm of the monastery. His eyes still searched the room, looking for something approval, maybe, or reassurance. He would learn soon enough that such things were scarce. After the meal, they returned to their duties. Some copied manuscripts in the scriptorium, their eyes red from hours of staring at parchment and ink. Others cleaned, or tended the animals, or carried firewood. Elric's task was in the cellar that day, checking barrels of salted meat and root vegetables stored for the coming winter. The cellar was dark and damp, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. It was not an unpleasant job, but it offered solitude, and solitude often led to thought. Dangerous, that. He moved slowly among the barrels, checking lids and inspecting ropes for signs of rot. Somewhere above him, the bell tolled again. The hours moved on, slow and steady, as if dragged by unseen hands. Elric paused and let his fingers rest on the rim of a wooden keg. The texture was rough, splintered with age. His mind wandered again, unbidden. He remembered a name, Isolde, a name he had not spoken in decades. Her face appeared in his mind, not as it had been in youth, but faded, like an old painting left too long in the sun. He had loved her once, or perhaps he had only imagined that he did. Love, like pain, had become hard to define. In the world beyond the monastery walls, emotions had shape and consequence. But within, everything softened. Even memories lost their edges. Still, the thought lingered, stubborn and warm, till the sound of footsteps pulled him back. Brother. Hugo descended the stairs, his lantern casting long, wavering shadows against the stone walls. He was the cellarer overseer of food and supplies, and one of the few who still retained a certain sharpness in his eyes. Hugo said nothing, but his presence was enough to send Elric back to work. Together, they moved in silence, checking inventory, noting which barrels would not last the season. They worked for an hour or more before Hugo finally spoke, his voice low and rough. "Bad year," he muttered, tapping a barrel with the hilt of his knife. "Winter will be lean." Elric nodded but said nothing. It was not his place to offer thoughts. Not aloud. That night, after compline prayers and the final bell, Elric lay in his cell and listened to the wind scrape against the walls. The abbey creaked inside, as if weary from centuries of devotion. He stared at the ceiling, the shadows from his candle dancing like silent figures across the beams. Sleep did not come easily. It rarely did. Instead, his thoughts drifted again, not to holy scripture or spiritual clarity, but to the long, winding path that had brought him there, to the things he had left behind, to the man he had once been. In the distance, he heard the faintest sound, a whisper, perhaps, or the rustle of robes. He sat up slowly. The corridor beyond his cell was dark, lit only by the flicker of torchlight. He rose, curiosity stirring something he had not felt in years. Moving silently, he stepped into the hall. What he found there, in that quiet hour, would begin a chain of events neither he nor the monastery could ever reverse. The corridor stretched ahead, long and narrow, the torchlight casting flickering halos along the damp stone walls. Elric walked slowly, the soles of his sandals barely making a sound against the cold flagstones. Each step echoed just enough to remind him that he was alone, or so he thought. The sound he had heard soft, fleeting had felt real, not the murmur of a dream, but something tangible, as if someone had passed his door in the dark. He followed the noise toward the rear cloister, where the walls thickened and the ceilings dipped lower, bearing the weight of age and forgotten intentions. Few monks wandered this part of the monastery at night. It was not forbidden, exactly, but discouraged. That was often the same thing in such places. Discouraged ideas, discouraged questions, discouraged truths. They were the bricks of that sacred prison. A breeze stirred faintly, cool against his cheek. There was a door slightly ajar, its heavy iron hinges not quite shut. The room beyond was the old vestry, long unused, where ceremonial robes and worn relics were stored. Elric stepped inside, letting the shadows embrace him. Dust motes floated in the candlelight, and the silence settled around him like a thick blanket. He scanned the room, but there was no one. Yet he felt watched. He moved to the far wall, where wooden cabinets stood closed, their locks long rusted and brittle. One was open a crack. He placed his hand on the edge, gently pulling it wider. Inside were rows of old garments, ornate chasubles embroidered with gold thread, now faded and brittle with time. At the very back, something glinted faintly. Elric reached for it, his fingers brushing against a metal chain. It was a crucifix larger than any he had seen, and oddly misshapen, with edges that curled unnaturally and a surface almost scorched. He stared at it, puzzled. It bore no resemblance to the relics normally kept in the monastery. Its craftsmanship was crude, almost primitive, and the figure upon the cross looked more tormented than divine. As he turned it over in his hand, he noticed symbols etched faintly into the metal, worn but unmistakable. Not Latin, not any language he recognized. Footsteps sounded behind him. He turned sharply, but the room was empty. Only his own breathing disturbed the quiet. He backed away slowly, setting the strange crucifix down on the cabinet's shelf. A feeling had crept into his chest, a low, steady hum of unease. He had spent years training his mind to be still, to push away questions, curiosity, and doubt. But something about the relic, its presence, its placement, refused to be silenced. The next morning dawned gray, the sun veiled by thick clouds that threatened rain. The air was damp, clinging to the stone walls and the folds of every robe. The monastery awoke as it always did, with silence, with stillness, with the slow rustle of monks emerging from their cells like shadows stretching toward the light. But Elric moved through the day differently now. Something inside him had shifted, not broken, but stirred. During morning labor, he watched the others more closely. The way Godric's gaze lingered on the abbot during prayers, the way Brother Hugo whispered beneath his breath in the cellar, the way the young novice Thomas flinched at sudden noises. He had become a watcher, a quiet collector of things unspoken. In the scriptorium that afternoon, he was assigned to copy an old homily on repentance. The ink was thick, the parchment brittle, and the quill scratched like dry leaves against stone. He dipped the pen, began to write, and paused. At the top of the page, in faded ink from some earlier scribe, were symbols barely visible, scrawled in the margins. They resembled the ones on the crucifix. He glanced around. No one was watching. He ran his finger over the markings, then turned to the shelf of reference texts. None offered any answers. These symbols were not recorded anywhere, At least not in the books the monks were allowed to access. That was the way of things. Knowledge, like bread, was portioned and controlled. Some loaves were too rich for common mouths. At the evening meal, he sat in silence as always, but his thoughts refused to stay quiet. Across the table, Thomas looked pale, his eyes rimmed with fatigue. Elric waited until the boy glanced up, then gave the faintest nodded gesture, barely more than a breath. Thomas hesitated, then gave a nod in return. It was enough. Later that night, after compline prayers, Elric waited near the garden path, cloaked in darkness. The air smelled of damp earth and rosemary. Thomas approached cautiously, his sandals barely making a sound. They said nothing, not at first. The wind carried distant owlsong through the trees. "Have you seen it?" Elric asked at last, his voice low. Thomas's face tightened. "The symbol?" Elric nodded. The boy hesitated. "In the novices' dormitory, scratched into the underside of one of the beds. I thought it was just a mark." "It isn't," Elric whispered. "It's something older." Thomas looked down at his hands. "There are stories, things the other novices whisper, about a place beneath the abbey, about brothers who disappeared." Elric listened, his thoughts racing. The monastery had stood for centuries, far longer than any living memory. It had changed hands, orders, and abbots, and in that span of time, so much had likely been buried, literally and otherwise. That night, sleep came in fragments. Elric lay awake, staring once more at the beams overhead, listening to the breathing of the abbey itself, the creaks, the sighs, the mutter of wind against stone. He thought of the crucifix, the symbols, the whispers, of the cellar. The cellar had tunnels, some sealed, others forgotten. He had walked them in his youth, when the abbey was less vigilant and his spirit less dull. Perhaps those paths still led somewhere. Perhaps some secrets had never been sealed. The days that followed were filled with the quiet investigation. Between tasks, Elric explored where he could. He found more markings beneath window ledges, etched into stone near the chapel's apse, hidden within the carvings of the chapter house. Someone had left a trail long ago, a trail meant to be followed, or perhaps meant to be buried. Then, one dusk, Brother Godric approached him. The former nobleman had grown gaunt in recent months, and his voice when he chose to use it was often tinged with weariness. But that night, there was something else behind his eyes. Not weariness, warning. "You're digging in old graves, brother," he murmured, standing beside Elric as they gathered water from the well. "Be careful what you wake." Elric said nothing, but Godric leaned closer. "Not all who leave this place do so in peace," he whispered, "and not all spirits wear white." Before Elric could ask more, the man was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the cloister. That night, Elric returned to the cellar with a torch and flint. He waited until the rest of the monastery had gone still. The silence was deeper at night, thick, velvety, broken only by the scurry of rats or the creak of beams. He lit the torch and descended. The air was cool and musty. The barrels cast long shadows. He moved past the storage racks, past the crates, to where the stone wall curved oddly. He had noticed it before, how the mortar looked newer, the stones less worn. Kneeling, he pressed his palm against it. Hollow, he tapped gently with the hilt of his knife. The sound was unmistakable. There was something behind the wall. He worked in silence, chipping at the mortar, prying loose one stone at a time. After what felt like hours, a small opening appeared. Beyond it, darkness, black as pitch. He held his torch closer. The flames danced, casting gold across stone steps leading down into the earth. Elric hesitated only for a breath, then stepped inside. The air was heavier there, moist, stale, filled with a scent he could not name. The steps led downward in a spiral, narrowing as they descended. Cobwebs clung to the ceiling, His torch revealed old brickwork, worn and cracked, with more of the same strange symbols carved into the walls. At the base of the steps was a door, wooden, iron-bound, sealed, with a latch that looked centuries old. He ran his fingers across it. Dust flacked away. He undid the latch. The door creaked open. Inside, he found a chamber. Its walls were covered in parchment, dozens, perhaps hundreds, nailed or pinned, each covered in drawings, symbols, and frenzied writing. Some were in Latin, others in languages unknown. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and upon it, something wrapped in cloth. Elric stepped closer, his heartbeat steady but strong. He reached out and drew back the cloth. Beneath it lay a book. Its cover was bound in leather, ancient and cracked, the spine reinforced with strips of hammered brass. No title marked it, only the same strange symbol, burned into the cover like a brand. As he opened it, the torchlight flickered. The pages were filled with symbols and diagrams, maps and passages, descriptions of rituals, visions, and events that defied explanation, references to buried truths, warnings, names of monks, long dead, accounts of things seen beneath the monastery, things not human. The room grew colder. Elric turned a page. Behind him, the door creaked. Something had followed him down. Elric did not turn immediately. His body stiffened, his hands still resting on the open page, the torch crackling gently in his other hand. The creak of the door echoed like a whisper, the air behind him colder now, as if the earth itself had exhaled. The silence pressed against his ears with an unnatural weight, like a chamber sealed for centuries, broken open not by chance, but by some ancient design. He turned his head slowly. The doorway stood empty. Only the flickering shadows remained, cast by the light of his flame, dancing across stone and parchment. But there was something in the air, a sense that the room had shifted, as though it now watched him as much as he watched it. The quiet wasn't ordinary. It was hollow and full at once, like a space where sound should have lived but had been scraped clean. Elric took a step back from the pedestal, carefully closing the book. The sound of its cover pressing shut was louder than he expected, like a verdict passed. He wrapped the cloth back around it with shaking fingers, though not from fear, at least, not the kind he recognized. What moved through his veins now was older, deeper, reverence and dread in equal measure. The parchment-covered walls loomed around him, their cryptic messages unreadable but urgent. He lifted the torch higher, letting the light pass over them. Many were marked with the same symbol, the curled, unnatural shape from the crucifix, repeating like a signature through time. Others depicted strange creatures and unsettling shapes. Men without faces, hands with too many fingers, towers burning beneath a black sky. Not drawings of literal events, perhaps, but visions, or memories. He turned back to the stairwell, the narrow passage that had brought him into the hidden chamber. With the book clutched tightly beneath his robe, he climbed slowly, torchlight, catching on every worn step, every shadow tucked in the corners. When he emerged once more into the cellar, the familiar scent of pickled brine and dry stone filled his lungs, grounding him, if only slightly. He replaced the loose stones and smeared the mortar with a damp cloth from the corner. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. The entrance was hidden once more. For now, back in his cell, the torch now extinguished, Elric sat cross-legged on the floor and set the book before him. He dared not open it again, not yet. His hands tingled, his thoughts tangled in a quiet storm of what he had found. Who had placed the book there? Why had the chamber been sealed? And more than that, what had been watching him? Sleep, once a distant companion, now evaded him entirely. He remained awake until the gray light of morning seeped into the sky, only rising when the first bell called the brothers to their prayers. That day passed differently than the rest. Not because the monastery changed, it didn't. It remained as unyielding as stone, the rituals as precise as ever. But something beneath the surface had shifted, something unseen and unspoken, like a crack forming in the foundation of a great wall. Elric walked through the routine's mass, labor, meals without truly seeing them. His ears searched for hidden voices. His eyes scanned every corridor for signs he had missed at a tea midday. While assisting in the infirmary, he saw the abbot for the first time in weeks. Abbot Aldwin was a gaunt man, older than most, his voice slow and deliberate. He rarely addressed the monks directly anymore. His body had weakened, and he spoke mostly in signs and nods. Yet even in silence, his presence commanded reverence and fear. Elric watched as the abbot entered the infirmary, nodding to the brothers who tended to an injured novice. The boy had fallen from a ladder in the library, and his arm hung at an odd angle. The abbot moved to him, placed a hand on the boy's forehead, and whispered a prayer, but as Elric looked on, he noticed something he hadn't before beneath the abbot's sleeve, where the robe shifted slightly as he knelt. There was a mark, a curling, dark brand along his forearm, a shape Elric now knew well, the same symbol. He turned quickly, pretending to arrange bandages. His breath caught halfway between shock and understanding. The abbot knew, not just of the symbol, but of everything. Perhaps he had placed the book in the chamber himself, or perhaps he had inherited it, a torch passed down through decades, centuries of silence. Later that evening, in the garden, Elric sat beside the old stone fountain, its water stilled by the coming frost. The leaves of the yew trees rustled faintly, and clouds gathered low in the sky. Godric joined him, settling onto the bench with the groan of old bones. "You found it," Godric said quietly, not looking at him. Elric didn't respond. "He didn't have to," Godric continued, his voice lower. "They say the order wasn't always what it is now, that the first brothers came here not to pray, but to protect. To guard something, or to bury it." "Bury what?" Elric asked. Godric turned, his eyes gray and dim, yet sharp. "Knowledge. Something not meant to be remembered." The wind picked up, whistling through the stones. Godric rose, adjusting his robe. "There's a reason they silence us," he added. "Not to keep peace, but to keep secrets." And with that, he walked away. The night that followed was restless. Elric sat by candlelight, the book once again before him. He had waited long enough. He opened it carefully, turning the pages with reverence and caution. The words inside shifted between languages, some familiar, others entirely foreign. Yet, certain patterns emerged, descriptions of visions, encounters with beings not of flesh and blood. Accounts of monks vanishing, of strange light seen deep beneath the crypt, of rituals meant not to summon but to contain. Then, he reached a section marked only with the date, 1143, that was nearly 200 years before the current monastery was built. The pages that followed were brittle, almost too delicate to touch, but they spoke of a different order, one whose members were no crosses, who carved their symbols into the foundation of the abbey before the first stone was ever laid. A group not aligned with Rome or Canterbury, but something else, an older faith, cloaked in robes of silence and buried beneath centuries of doctrine. Their purpose had not been worship, but vigilance. They were not monks. They were watchers, and whatever they had been watching, whatever they had feared, it was not gone. Elric closed the book and sat in silence, the candle flickering as though uneasy. Outside his window, the moon had risen, pale and full, casting long shadows across the abbey grounds. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, an unusual sound for that hour. He extinguished the flame and lay back, the book hidden once more beneath his mattress, but sleep still refused him. Instead, His thoughts lingered on the echoes of forgotten prayers and the faces of men who had once believed in something far more ancient than faith. He wondered what had become of them, and whether he had already begun to follow in their footsteps. The morning bell rang out across the frost-kissed fields, tolling its solemn note through a sky that had not yet decided whether to welcome sun or rain. A low mist clung to the roots of the land, curling through the garden paths and over the silent graves of monks long forgotten. The abbey was awake again, or at least walking. That was how Elric thought of it now, not as a place truly alive, but as a great body moving through its rehearsed motions, limbs and lungs functioning not from spirit, but from habit. He moved quietly through the cloister, the echo of his own steps, reminding him that, no matter how many shared those stone paths, a man could be deeply alone, even in a house of God. The book remained hidden beneath his mattress, wrapped in cloth, its presence pressing on his mind like an unanswered question. That morning, he performed his duties without error, but without presence. His hands shelled dried beans in the kitchen, his body bent in prayer. His eyes followed scripture, but his thoughts ran elsewhere, toward the hidden chamber, toward the abbot's brand, toward the image of a past not dead, but sleeping. Later, during their hour of assigned silence in the library, Elric slipped between shelves not often visited. Dust blanketed the volumes, their books too obscure, too ancient, or too fragile to be of regular use. Some were in Latin, others in Greek, and a few in languages with curves and markings unfamiliar even to the monastery's oldest scholars. He did not expect to find an answer, only a thread, something to follow, and he did. A crumbling folio bound in rawhide, its pages yellowed and thin, revealed a brief reference in a margin: Ordo Vigilans, Custodiens Veritatem, non scribent est servant. The watchful order, guardians of the truth. They do not write, but preserve. He read the line again, the words burning into his thoughts like brands. It was them, the ones who had left the marks, the ones who had sealed the chamber, the ones the abbey had buried beneath centuries of new prayers. That afternoon, as he swept the north transept, he saw the abbot again. Aldwyn walked slowly, his pace as measured as the liturgy. Their eyes met for only a moment, but Elric saw recognition there, quiet, resigned. The abbot knew, and the silence between them was not just habit, it was protection, or warning. That evening, when the bells called them to the vesper meal, the sky had begun to weep a soft, cold drizzle that clung to every robe and hood. The dining hall was as it always had been, narrow, dim, filled with the faint scent of boiled lentils and stale bread. But Elric noticed something different in the seating arrangement. The novice Thomas was missing. He scanned the room once, twice, then again. His place was empty. He kept his expression still, but his stomach twisted in slow knots. After the meal, when the monks dispersed, Elric slipped away beneath the archways and made his way to the dormitory. He passed beds, cloaks, and washbasins. No sign of Thomas. The boy's bedding was gone, not merely left unmade but entirely removed, as if he had never existed. Elric made his way to the cloister garden, the wind now bending the yew branches into whispering shapes. Godric was there, seated on a worn bench with his eyes turned upward toward the sky, as though searching for something it could no longer offer. "He's gone," Elric said softly. Godric didn't move. Then he got too close. "What do you mean?" Elric stepped forward. "What happened to him?" Godric turned slowly. "Sometimes, when they think you know too much, you're moved, reassigned, they say, but no one knows where, or if." Elric sat beside him, the rain tapping softly on the stone around them. "Why don't we speak of these things?" he asked. "Because," Godric said, his voice thin, "no one wants to remember the time before obedience, when truth was more important than silence, when faith was not a shield, but a path. Elric looked at the ground, the memory of Thomas's tired eyes fresh in his mind. They're still down there, aren't they? He whispered. Those who stayed behind, those who buried the book. Godric nodded. Some say their bones were never recovered, that they remain beneath us, watching, waiting. The wind rustled the ivy against the wall. Somewhere, far off, the bell tolled again, not for prayer, but for rain, a signal to cover the manuscripts and extinguish the open fires. That night, unable to rest, Elric crept once more to the cellar. He lit a single candle and made his way to the wall he had broken. With careful movements, he loosened the stones and opened the passage. The air that poured out was colder now, heavier. He descended. The chamber greeted him as it had before. Parchment walls, the pedestal, and the weight of secrets. But something had changed. On the floor, near the book, lay a scrap of cloth. He recognized it immediately. Thomas's sleeve. It was torn, damp with soil, and marked faintly with the smear of something too dark for wine. Elric's hands trembled as he picked it up. The candlelight danced as though nervous. He was not alone in the chamber. He heard the breath first, not his own. Slower, closer, a slow, measured inhale from just beyond the reach of his candle. He turned quickly, lifting the flame. But the breath did not stop. It came from the walls, or the shadows, or the memory of what once lived there. Then, a whisper barely formed. A name, Elric. He froze. The whisper came again, curling around his name like smoke, soft and sibilant, not entirely human. He backed toward the stairwell, the book clutched once more beneath his robe. The symbols along the stone glowed faintly in the candlelight, their shapes seeming to twist and shimmer, not carved, but alive. He turned and fled the chamber, his breath fast, the sound of the voice following him until the cellar swallowed it once more. Back in his cell, he sealed the wall again and sat in the dark. The book lay before him, unopened, but he now understood what he had awakened. The Watchers had never left. They had simply waited, and now they had remembered his name. The next few days passed beneath a shadow that no sunlight could lift. Though the sky cleared and the rains eased, there was something heavier now clinging to the walls of the monastery, something colder than frost and quieter than silence. Elric moved through the halls like a ghost among ghosts, his presence unnoticed, his eyes catching every detail that others refused to see. Thomas's absence was never spoken of. His name was never mentioned. His bed was reassigned to another novice. Within 2 days, the sheets changed, his robes folded and given to someone new. There was no ceremony, no inquiry, just disappearance, quiet, clean, complete. Elric felt the weight of the book at all hours, even when it wasn't with him. The knowledge it held, the warnings it whispered in ink and parchment, had begun to bleed into his waking life. The words swam behind his eyes in idle moments, symbols repeating themselves in candlelight, the curling marks hiding in the corners of stone arches and cracked frescoes. And the voice, he heard it sometimes now, just once, in the dormitory, as he drifted towards sleep, his name again, spoken not with anger, but with recognition, as if whatever lived beneath the monastery no longer merely observed him, but now waited for him to act. It wasn't fear that followed him anymore. It was inevitability. On the 3rd night since Thomas vanished, Elric sat in the scriptorium well past curfew, the light of a single candle flickering across vellum and ink. The brothers had long since retired, and only the rustling of pages and the distant patter of wind filled the room. Before him lay a fragment of text he'd uncovered during the day, a list of penances recorded in the year 1176. Most were ordinary lashes, fasts, silent vigils. But one entry stood out. Frater Hugo detentis pro sermoni vetito ad te nebar is. To The darkness.it was not a term he recognized. Not a punishment, exactly. More like a sentence. No further record of that brother Hugo could be found. As if he, too, had been swallowed by the abbey's stone throat, he took the page and tucked it inside the book he carried hidden in his robe. The next morning brought an unusual summons. Elric was called to the abbot's chambers. It was a rare thing, and most who received such an invitation did so only once in their lives. He walked the narrow staircase with steady steps, his hands clasped in practiced reverence. The air grew warmer the higher he climbed, thick with the scent of tallow and burning cedar. At the top stood a heavy wooden door, carved with vines and crosses. He knocked once. "Enter," came the voice from within. He stepped inside. The chamber was modest, but rich tapestries lined the walls. An ancient desk stood beneath the narrow window, overlooking the frost-dusted fields beyond the monastery. Abbot Aldwin sat there, his hands folded before him, eyes heavy-lidded and calm. "Brother Elric," he said, not unkindly, "you have been with us many years." "Yes, father, you were once a merchant's son, were you not?" Elric hesitated. "I was. Do you regret coming here?" A pause. "I did," Elric replied, "but not now." The abbot nodded, as though he expected the answer. His eyes moved slowly to a folded cloth on his desk. He opened it, revealing the crucifix, the strange one Elric had found in the vestry. "You recognize this?" Aldwin said. "I do." The abbot touched its surface, his fingers tracing the odd, curled symbol. "It was left to us, passed down. Not all relics are meant for adoration. Some are meant to warn." He looked up, his gaze heavy now, sharp and quiet. "You have found the book." There was no question in his voice, only certainty. Elric said nothing. "Good," the abbot said softly. "Then you must understand why silence is not merely sacred here. It is necessary for survival." He stood, slowly, his frame stooped, beneath the weight of years and knowledge both. "The abbey rests upon something older than our order, older than the land's written history. Before this was a monastery, it was a fortress, and before that, a shrine. Men have always been drawn to this hill not because of God, but because of something they cannot name." He stepped around the desk. "We built over it, prayed over it, but we never truly sealed it." Eric's breath caught in his throat. "Thomas?" he asked, the abbot's eyes dim. He opened a door he should not have known about. Elric's fists clenched. "So you sent him away?" "No," the abbot whispered. "He was taken." The silence between them deepened. "Do not look for him," Aldwin said. "You are not strong enough." He returned to his chair, the crucifix still in hand. "You may go." Elric left without speaking, the weight of what he had just heard pressing against his chest like a stone. He walked the cloister in a daze, the wind cool and sharp on his skin. The abbot's words echoed, "not strong enough." He had no idea what that meant, but he intended to find out. That night, he returned to the secret chamber, this time with preparation. He brought rope, a flask of oil, and an iron blade dulled by time, but still firm in his grip. The wall came apart more easily now, his hands having memorized the shape of every loose stone. The cold air met him like an old friend. He descended. This time, he did not stop at the pedestal. Instead, he searched the walls, passing the parchments, the diagrams, and the strange half-legible prayers. One corner of the chamber was different, its stones darker, the mortar newer. He pressed against them, ran his hand along their shape. There, nearly hidden, was a small depression in the stone, a keyhole of sorts. From beneath his robe, he retrieved the crucifix he had taken from the abbot's chamber. It fit. The wall slid open with a hiss of stone against stone. Beyond it, stairs led deeper still, and what lay beneath the monastery, Elric now knew, was not just silence, not just history, but the very thing the watchers had feared and perhaps worshipped. He stepped forward. The air grew warmer as he descended, not with heat, but with presence. The scent was thick and metallic, like rust and damp earth, and beneath it all, something sweet, cloying, natural. He reached the bottom of the stairwell and found a vast cavern lit by no torches. Yet it glowed, dim and pulsing, as if the stone itself breathed light. In the center of the room stood a monolith, dark, smooth, covered in the same spiraling symbols. Around it, the remains of robes and bones, and lying at its base, pale and unmoving, Thomas Elric rushed forward, falling to his knees. The boy's eyes were open, but they did not see. His lips moved faintly. A whisper escaped. "They know you now." Then he fell silent. From the walls, something stirred. Not movement, but watching. Elric did not rise at once. He knelt beside the boy, his hands trembling slightly, his breath shallow in the thick, warm air of the underground chamber. The glow from the stone monolith pulsed gently, rhythm not unlike a heartbeat, slow, ancient, and alive in ways that defied reason. The symbols along its surface curled and branched like veins, shifting subtly beneath the skin of the rock. It felt like standing in the presence of something that had no name, no voice, and yet knew exactly who he was. Thomas's skin was cool, his breathing faint, but steady. His eyes, wide and glassy, blinked only once. Whatever had taken hold of him, whatever had marked him, had not killed him, but it had pulled him inward, far from the surface of thought or memory. Elric whispered the boy's name, gently at first, then more firmly, his voice echoing dully in the chamber's soft acoustics. Thomas did not answer. Elric laid a hand on his shoulder and turned his head slightly toward the monolith. His eyes moved not in reaction to the gesture, but to something unseen, a slow, drawn motion, as if tracking a movement behind the stone, in a place beyond vision. Then his lips parted once more. "They dream through us." The words were spoken with a voice that sounded both like Thomas and not. Elric froze, the echo of those syllables lingering longer than they should have, as if the air itself had absorbed and repeated them. He stood slowly, turning to face the monolith. He felt it watching not with eyes, but with awareness, as though its very presence extended into the mind. It wasn't malevolent in the way of human anger or cruelty. It was indifferent, vast, like a mountain that does not care when a village is buried beneath its landslide, or a tide that washes clean without purpose. It was something beyond morality. He should have left. He should have turned back up the stairs and sealed the wall forever, but instead, he reached out. His fingers hovered inches from the surface of the stone. The warmth radiating from it was faint but undeniable. Then, very gently, he touched it. The symbols shifted. Not moved, shifted, as though they had always been there, waiting beneath the skin that now dissolved under contact. They lit in a spiral, one after another, blooming like fire along invisible lines. His breath caught in his throat. A hum filled his ears, not sound, exactly, but sensation. A vibration in the bones, and then a memory that wasn't his. He was standing in the same chamber, but the walls were new, smooth, freshly carved. The air was clearer, and monks in unfamiliar robes surrounded the monolith, chanting, not in Latin, but in a language that twisted the tongue and rang like bells underwater. One of them stepped forward, arms outstretched, eyes rolled back in ecstasy or agony. He touched the stone and the light engulfed him. Elric blinked. He was back. The vision passed like a gust of wind, leaving behind silence and the taste of copper on his tongue. He turned back to Thomas, now lying peacefully again, as though asleep. Whatever had passed through him, through both of them, had retreated. For now, Elric gathered the boy into his arms and carried him back up the stairs, one slow step at a time, the stone passage pressing in close. The glow of the chamber faded behind him, and yet it didn't feel absent. It simply waited. Back in the cellar, Elric laid the boy down beside the wall and lit a small oil lamp. Thomas breathed deeply, his eyelids fluttering as if caught in a dream. Elric leaned close. "They know you now," Thomas had said. Who were they? Watchers? Or the ones the Watchers had feared? He had no answers, only a growing weight of understanding that the monastery was not a sanctuary built upon faith, but a seal built upon fear. And the seal was cracking. The next day brought snow. The first of the season. The monastery grounds turned white under a sky the color of wet ash, and the monks walked the paths between their duties like figures cut from wood, slow, silent, shaped by habit. Elric moved among them as always, but his eyes searched constantly for signs, whispers, hidden movements, glances too quickly averted. He found none, but that too was telling. They knew something had shifted, and they were pretending it had in single quotes. T midday. He returned to the infirmary under the pretense of checking supplies. The shelves were well stocked, and the medicus greeted him with a nod. But Elric made his way to the back, where an unused cot waited behind a curtain. He pulled it aside. Thomas lay there, eyes closed. And no one had said he'd return. No one acknowledged his presence, but he was there, bathed, dressed, and silent. Elric approached the boy slowly. "You were with me," he whispered. "Do you remember?" Thomas did not stir, but his lips moved, ever so slightly. "They are beneath everything," came the whisper. "Not just the abbey, the land, the people. They sleep under history." Elric's heart thudded. Thomas's eyes opened. "They want memory," he said softly, "but not words. Memory without shape." Then he closed his eyes again. The curtain fluttered faintly, though there was no wind. That night, Elric lit no candles. He sat in the dark of his cell, staring at the crucifix on the wall, the ordinary one, the one every monk received upon initiation. Its surface was smooth, featureless, sterile, a symbol of doctrine, not experience, of law, not truth. He took it down. Behind it, scratched into the stone, was the symbol, the same curling mark. It had been there all along. The next morning, he approached Brother Godric in the scriptorium. The older monk was copying a psalm, his hand steady, his script tight and flawless. "I need to know," Elric said, quietly but firmly, "about the order before us. The Watchers." Godric paused. Then, with a slow breath, he stood and led Elric behind the shelves to a locked cabinet rarely opened. From within it, he retrieved a rolled manuscript, bound in red cord and sealed with black wax. "Don't read it here," he said, "and don't let anyone see you take it." Elric nodded and slipped it beneath his robe. That evening, in the candlelight of his cell, he broke the seal. The scroll was brittle but legible. It told of a sect that came before even the first official monastic presence on the hill, a group that called itself Ordo Vigilans, the Watchful Order. They had no allegiance to Rome. They took no vows of chastity or poverty, only silence and remembrance. They were keepers of a presence beneath the land, a force without form, known only by its effects. The document did not call it evil, only vast. It referred to it as somnus, anticus, the ancient sleep, a dreaming thing, a slumbering witness, and the duty of the Watchers was not to destroy it, but to guard it from awakening. The final line chilled him. "Should the silence break, the dreamer will stir, and what dreams then will shape the waking world?" Elric set the scroll down, his hands cold. It wasn't just a relic beneath the monastery. It was something alive, and the silence of the monks, their long obedience, their rituals, their secrecy, it wasn't about piety. It was containment. And now, something had shifted. The silence was cracking. The dreamer was listening. The snow had settled thickly now, blanketing the abbey grounds in a silence even deeper than before. The usual sounds of footfall and whispered prayers were muffled beneath the weight of frost and frozen air. Smoke curled thinly from the chimney stacks, the scent of burning peat drifting faintly through the stone corridors. The world above seemed hushed, as if mirroring the slow breath of something stirring far below. Elric moved quietly through the cloister, his robe heavier than usual, not from the cold, but from what he carried beneath it. The manuscript Godric had given him was hidden beneath layers of wool, the ancient parchment fragile and still dusted with the scent of old ink and grave mold. It felt warm against his chest, almost as if it breathed. That morning, his assigned task was to accompany Brother Hildric to the chapel crypt, where broken icons and damaged relics were stored for eventual repair or burial. Hildric was slow to move, his limbs stiff from age, and Elric offered to carry most of the weight. The crypt was accessed by a narrow stair behind the altar, descending into the oldest part of the monastery, where the air changed not in temperature, but in quality. Time moved differently there, slower, heavier. The air smelled of wax and stone, and something else, something metallic and still. As Hildric sorted through damaged chalices and moth-eaten altar cloths, Elric drifted toward a sealed arch in the far wall. It had been bricked up centuries ago, the masonry uneven and stained. A narrow, almost imperceptible mark was scratched into the mortar near its base. The symbol again. Faint, ancient. Watching, he didn't touch it, but he did not look away either. When Hildric called for help with the cracked reliquary, Elric turned and rejoined him, but his mind remained behind with that sealed arch, with what might lie just beyond it. Another passage, another chamber, another whisper in the dark. Back above ground, the light was thin and gray, and the snow had not stopped falling. The bell called them to midday prayers, but Elric lingered near the chapel steps, letting the others pass. His thoughts were loud, louder than the chants that echoed within the nave, louder than the voice of the abbot reciting the psalms. He could feel it now, that slow, steady change, not just in himself, but in the monastery. The others had noticed it too, though few would ever admit it. There were fewer birds on the grounds now. The crows had gone silent. The dogs that once barked in the nearby village no longer stirred at night. Even the wind seemed reluctant to pass through the arches. Something ancient had turned its eye toward the world again. That night, he returned to the chamber below. He waited until the last bell had rung and the halls were silent. With the precision of ritual, he moved each stone from the cellar wall and slipped once more into the cold passage. The descent was no easier for being familiar. The deeper he went, the heavier the air became, until even the torch he carried felt like it flickered underwater. The monolith still stood in the center of the chamber and changed. But something was different. Thomas was gone. No body, no trace, just the cold imprint of where he had lain. Elric circled the stone, his fingers trailing along the walls, searching for signs. He found a single scrap of parchment near the pedestal, half burned and barely legible. Upon it, the beginning of a prayer, or perhaps a warning. What stirs beneath the seal of flesh shall dream no longer when the name is known. The rest was scorched. He stared at it for a long time before slipping it into his robe and turning back toward the stair. As he climbed, the air behind him felt warmer, thicker, almost like breath at the back of his neck. He didn't look back. In his cell, he lay awake through the night. When he did sleep, the dreams returned, this time clearer. He stood in a forest not unlike the woods surrounding the monastery, but the trees were older, their bark carved with symbols. The ground pulsed beneath his feet, and above, the stars swam in slow, deliberate spirals. He heard chanting, not human, not language, a single word repeated, over and over. He awoke just before dawn with that word still echoing in his ears, though he could not repeat it, not aloud, not even in thought. He rose and bathed in cold water, then made his way to the kitchen for early labor. The other brothers moved like ghosts through steam and smoke. None of them spoke. Later that afternoon, Brother Godric met him at the cloister's edge. "You've gone deeper than most," he said, not looking at him. "Deeper than you should," Elric nodded, "but not deep enough." Godric turned toward him now, his expression strange, not fearful, not resigned, but something close to reverence. "There are older names than Christ in these stones," he said quietly. "Older than Rome, older than language. Do you know them?" Elric asked. "I knew one," Godric said. "I spoke it once, and I have never spoken since." Elric stared at him, the weight of those words settling like frost in his chest. Godric placed a hand on his shoulder. "Do not seek the name," he whispered. "It will find you." He walked away. That evening, after the final prayer, the abbot called Elric to his chamber once again. The old man sat in shadow, a candle flickering low beside him. "The boy is gone," he said without preamble. "You know that?" "Yes," Elric answered. "Do you understand why?" Elric paused. "Because we broke the silence." The abbot nodded slowly. "Silence is not just obedience," he said. "It is a wall, a veil, a lock. The chants, the rituals, the prayers, they are not for worship. They are for warding." He stood with effort, placing something into Elric's hands. A key, old, iron, worn smooth. "It opens the lower crypt," he said. "But only once." Elric looked down at it. "What's beneath?" The abbot turned away. The first mistake. That night, Elric did not sleep. He sat beside the candle until the flame burned low, and when the monastery grew still, he took the key and moved once more through the sleeping halls, past the chapel, past the bricked arch. To a narrow door he had never seen opened. The key slid into the lock with a soft, metallic sigh. The door creaked, and beneath it, stairs, worn by centuries, leading down. Elric stood at the threshold for a moment, his hand resting on the iron key. The door now opened behind him like a mouth of stone. The chill that drifted up from the stairwell was not the chill of air, but of stillness, ancient and undisturbed. No torchlight flickered below, no lantern glowed. The darkness beneath was total. He lit his lamp, shielding the flame with one hand as he stepped through the low frame. The stone steps wound downward in a spiral, their edges worn smooth by time, and the tread of long vanished feet. The air smelled of damp limestone, of decay and iron and smoke long since extinguished. The further he descended, the less sound followed him. Even his own footsteps seemed to fade, absorbed into walls too old for echoes. He passed carvings along the walls, not crosses, not saints, but the curling symbols he had come to recognize, arranged in sequences he could not interpret. Some glowed faintly beneath the soot, others seemed freshly scratched, as though added by an unseen hand in recent days. At the base of the stairwell, the corridor opened into a large, circular chamber, its ceiling low and domed, its walls lined with niches like the mouths of forgotten tombs. Some held bones, others held remnants of robes, rusted chalices, or fragments of scripture eaten by mildew. But in the center of the chamber stood a single object, a chair, carved from dark wood, reinforced with iron, its base bolted directly into the stone floor. It was not ornate, nor reverent. It was not made for prayer. It was made to hold. Elric approached it slowly, the flame of his lamp dancing on the slick surface of the metal rings embedded into the armrests and footboard. Shackles. The leather was cracked but intact. Beneath the chair, a stain had seeped deep into the stone, a dark shadow of something that had long ago bled and never dried. He turned away, breath shallow. In the far wall, Another arch, this one not bricked, but sealed with a heavy wooden door, carved with the spiral symbol in thick, repeating lines. He stepped toward it, lifted the latch, and pushed. The door creaked open with a sound like breath released after years of holding. Beyond it lay another chamber, smaller, lower, its walls covered floor to ceiling in writing, some scratched directly into the stone, others painted in thick black strokes. The language changed from line to line: Latin, Greek, Aramaic, and something older. The writing swirled around a single object in the center of the room, an altar, stone, square, cold, unadorned, except for a basin carved into its surface. Above it, a shape, a figure hung in the air. Elric stepped closer, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. It was not suspended by rope or iron. It floated weightless, arms outstretched, face turned upward, its mouth slightly open. A man's body, bare, pale as bone. His eyes were closed, and his chest rose and fell with an impossibly slow breath, once every 10 seconds. Still alive. But how? Elric stumbled backward, his hand brushing the altar's edge. The basin held something thick, dark, and glistening. Not water, not oil, blood. Fresh. He turned his eyes back to the floating figure. There were marks on the man's skin, carved symbols, running from his collarbone down to his ribs. Spirals, curves, slashes. The same markings Elric had seen everywhere on stone, in ink, in dreams. Suddenly, the figure's eyes opened. White, entirely white. Not blank but full. They looked directly at Elric. And then the voice came not from the mouth, not from the body, but from the air itself. You have come too far. Elric's knees nearly buckled. The lamp trembled in his hand, casting wild shadows across the walls. What are you? He whispered. I am what is remembered. The voice carried no sound. It simply was, like thought itself, shaped into breath. What is this place? A temple buried in a tomb, buried in a lie. Elric took a step back, the air around him growing warmer, thicker, vibrating faintly in his chest. The Watchers sealed it, he said. They buried you. They buried fear, the voice replied. Not me. Elric's mind reeled. Why? The voice paused. To keep the world dreaming. He turned and ran. The hallway spun around him, the spirals on the wall seeming to stretch and follow, the very air tugging at his robes like hands reaching to stop him. His lamp blew out mid-stride, plunging the stairwell into black. He climbed in darkness, panting, hands scraping stone, knees knocking against the edges of the steps. At last, he reached the door and slammed it behind him, the lock clattering into place with a thunderous finality. Only then did he realize he was not alone. The abbot stood at the top of the stairs. He held no lamp, only silence. You saw him, he said. Elric could not answer. He was the first, the abbot whispered, the first to speak the name aloud. And now he waits, as we all must. Elric backed against the wall. You knew? The abbot nodded. All abbots know. We are not guardians of souls. We are wardens of a well. He stepped forward, placing a hand on Elric's shoulder. The Watchers tried to contain it with silence, but silence fails. Eventually, someone always listens. Elric stared into his eyes. What happens now? The abbot looked past him, toward the locked door. The dream begins again, and this time, remembers. Elric did not speak for days. He went about his duties as expected. He tended the candles in the nave, swept the frost-dusted cloisters, helped prepare bread in the stone ovens, but his hands moved with the vacant precision of someone whose thoughts had sunk too deeply to reach the surface. The faces around him blurred, their words muffled by the endless echo of what he had seen in the lower crypt. The figure, suspended in breathless eternity. The whisper that wasn't sound, the symbols crawling beneath the skin of the stone. It clung to him like wet cloth, never drying, never loosening. The others noticed, but as always in the monastery, no one asked. Not even Godric. Not even the abbot. Though they knew that Elric had stepped into something now watching him from within. The snow thickened that week, a slow, heavy fall that muted every footstep, wrapped every bell toll in cotton. The roads to the nearby village were now impassable, and the monastery stood isolated under gray skies, its windows dark by mid-afternoon. The monks began to light candles earlier each day, not to drive away night, but to keep the shadows from moving closer. One evening, as the wind moaned softly beneath the eaves, Brother Cuthwin collapsed during vespers. No warning, no sickness. His knees simply buckled, and he fell to the cold flagstones without a cry. When the others gathered around, they found his eyes wide open, lips parted slightly, his body cold, not dead, but unreachable. He was moved to the infirmary, where he lay, unmoving, breathing only faintly, his eyes never blinking. When Elric passed the room later that night, he heard a whisper rise from within. Not a groan, not sleep-talk. It was the same sound Thomas had made, a language without shape, a word that curled around itself and vanished before memory could hold it. The same voice, the same dream. It had begun again. The abbot gave no explanation. He only increased the hours of prayer, added new chants to the evening ritual, longer, slower, in languages none of them had spoken aloud before. The choir faltered over the syllables, but the rhythm remained. Elric recognized some of the phrases from the scroll Godric had shown him. The prayers were not praises, they were bindings. Each syllable was a stitch, each chant a knot pulled tighter. Around the edges of a wound the abbey could no longer hide. One morning, while walking past the vestry, Elric paused to restock the lamp oil. As he stepped into the small chamber, he noticed something wrong with the floor. One of the flagstones near the far wall had shifted, as though lifted and set slightly out of place. He knelt and ran his fingers along its edge. It came loose. Beneath it, darkness. He lit a small taper and leaned closer. The space beneath wasn't large, barely the size of a chest, but what lay inside stole the air from his lungs. Bones, child-sized, wrapped in a monk's robe, and beneath the bones, a tablet of stone carved in spirals, its surface stained with something long, soaked into its pores. He dropped the stone slab back into place and covered it, but the silence in the vestry lingered. It pressed against him on the walk back through the cloister, through the refectory, through the long line of seated monks chanting their evening prayers. The words now seemed hollow. He could hear the wind howling beyond the walls, not like wind, but like breath, rhythmic, measured, waiting. He passed Brother Godric near the stair and stopped. "They've been doing this for centuries," Elric said quietly. "Hiding it." Godric's eyes met his, the lines on his face deeper now, as though carved by time itself. "Yes, and the others? The ones before us? Some stayed," Godric murmured. "Some left, but none escaped it." Elric stared at him. "What is it?" Godric's answer was so soft, Elric wasn't sure it had been spoken at all. The end of forgetting. That night, Elric opened the hidden chamber once more, though the wall now resisted him, the stones colder, the mortar harder. It was as if the abbey itself had begun to harden its shell, to deny even him. But he forced it open and stepped down into the stillness. The monolith remained unchanged, but something lay at its base, a small scroll, rolled and sealed in black wax. He picked it up and broke the seal. Inside was a single sentence, scrawled in a hand he didn't recognize. "You are not the first dreamer." There was no name, no signature, only the truth, wrapped in dread. He sat before the stone for what felt like hours, the cold seeping into his bones, the silence surrounding him like a cocoon. He wanted to cry, to scream, but neither would help now. The dream had grown stronger. The monastery could no longer contain it. When he finally returned to the surface, he found the halls empty. The bell had not rung for morning prayers. No light burned in the chapel. No voices rose from the refectory. He wandered the cloisters and, mounting a knees until he found Godric seated on a bench beneath the great yew. "They're gone," Elric said. Godric didn't answer at first. Then he looked up slowly. "They answered the call," he said. Elric frowned. "What call?" Godric nodded toward the horizon. "The one beneath us." Elric turned to follow his gaze. The sky was darker than it should have been, not clouded veiled, and beneath it, in the fields near the tree line, he could just make out shapes, figures, moving slowly toward the monastery, silent, barefoot, eyes wide open, not strangers, not villagers, brothers, the monks, all of them, walking away from the abbey, toward the woods, toward the dark. They moved in procession, dozens of them, robes trailing across the frost-bitten earth, their hands hanging limply at their sides, their feet bare despite the snow that coated the fields. There was no chant, no prayer, no whisper shared between them, only breath rising like smoke in the cold morning air. Their faces were calm, too calm, like those who had finally found the answer to a question they could no longer remember asking. Elric stood frozen beneath the archway of the cloister, watching them disappear one by one into the tree line at the far edge of the field. The forest loomed tall and black behind them, and where the shadows thickened, they seemed to dissolve into the mist as if the woods had swallowed them whole. Beside him, Godric had not moved. "Where are they going?" Elric whispered, though he already sensed the answer. Godric's voice was low, almost apologetic. "Back to the beginning." Elric turned to him. "You stayed behind." "I always have," Godric said. "Each time." That hung in the air like dust suspended in sunlight. "How many times has this happened?" Godric's lips pressed together. "Enough to forget the names. Never the outcome." Elric looked back to the forest. The last robe disappeared between the trees. He did not know what held him in place. Fear, perhaps, or something more ancient than fear. A knowing that to follow would mean surrendering more than his body. It would mean surrendering memory, self, the very boundaries of thought. Later that evening, the monastery was silent in a way it had never been. Not the hush of prayer or sleep, but the silence of abandonment. The bells did not ring. No fires were lit. The ovens sat cold. The chapel unentered. Only Elric and Godric remained, walking its empty corridors like shadows that had forgotten they once had shape. The dining hall, once filled with the low hum of whispered psalms and clinking bowls, now echoed with every footstep like the vault of a tomb. In the scriptorium, the pages of open books fluttered slightly in a draught that had no origin. Even the crucifixes along the stone walls seemed to lean differently in the flicker of the lamplight, as if their weight had subtly shifted. "They answered the call," Elric said again, as if repeating the phrase would reveal some hidden logic behind it. "Why not you?" Godric stared into the fireless hearth, eyes dim. "Because I remember too much." Elric let that settle. Then, gently, he asked, "And me?" Godric didn't answer, but the look in his eyes was not pity. It was grief. The next morning, Elric woke to the sound of breathing in the hallway. He rose slowly, expecting Godric, but when he opened the door, the corridor was empty, yet the sound remained steady, measured, like something asleep just around the corner. He followed it, down past the chapel, past the vestry, toward the sealed room beneath the floorboards. He did not carry a torch this time, only the key the abbot had given him days before. The lock turned. Without resistance, the door opened, not into darkness now, but into a faint glow, the deep orange of coals buried beneath ash. The stair awaited, and so he descended. Each step felt softer beneath his feet, warmer, the stone itself no longer cold, no longer inert. It pulsed, a soft, impossible rhythm, like breath through stone, like sleep dreaming itself awake. He reached the chamber. The monolith stood where it had always stood, but around it now were figures, silent, still. The monks, kneeling, in circles, eyes closed, palms open, facing inward. As if listening to something only the bones could hear, Elric stepped between them slowly, moving toward the monolith, whose symbols now glowed in waves, each spiral lighting for a moment, then dimming, then lighting again in a sequence that felt like language. Not words, not phrases, but intention, thought in its rawest form. He could hear it now, through ears, but from within, and whisper, not in Latin, not in any tongue he had ever learned, yet understood. It said, "You have come far enough to listen." The chamber dimmed. A figure moved among the kneeling monks, not tall, not robed, bare, pale, eyes closed, the same figure he had seen suspended in the lower crypt. But here, it walked. Its feet did not touch the floor, and yet it moved with purpose. The eyes opened, and though Elric could not look directly at them, he felt them burn into his thoughts. The voice returned. "You were the last to resist." He shook his head. "No, I'm not here to surrender or pause. You already have." The monks around him stirred, not to rise, but to hum. A low, droning sound, like breath passed through a broken pipe. Elric felt it in his chest, in his ribs, in his teeth. The sound wasn't noise. It was shape. It bent the walls inward. It pulled memory outward, and then it showed him, not visions, but feelings. The hunger of something that had no mouth. The seeing of something that had no eyes. The patience of something that could not die. The dreamer. The wound. The silence. And then the breaking. He saw the beginning of the monastery, but of before language, before religion, before even man, something deep, something curled around the earth's bones like roots around a grave, waiting, sleeping, bound not by chains, but by forgetfulness. By silence. And now, the silence had cracked, and memory returned like a flood, not only to Elric, but to the world above. When he opened his eyes, he was standing in the nave of the chapel, alone. The snow had stopped, but the sky outside had darkened, not with storm, but with stillness. The bells had fallen silent, but the wind now carried song, not of monks, not of men, of memory, the kind that does not fade, only waits. And beneath the stone floor, far below the crypt, beneath the sealed chamber, and the monolith, and the buried bones, something turned. Something vast. Something dreaming still, but no longer alone. Elric's hands trembled as he stood in the silent chapel, the air thick with the weight of something unsaid. The snow outside had cleared, leaving the sky an unnatural shade of slate gray, as though the heavens themselves had pulled away, leaving the world suspended in a cold breath. The bells had stopped, their ringing silenced forever by something deeper than any earthly force. His body felt distant, as if it were not his own. His thoughts drifted slowly, and yet everything seemed impossibly clear. The echoes of the dream, still reverberating in his chest, the hum that had once filled the lower chamber, now a lingering vibration that swayed through his bones. It was as though the monastery itself had come alive, breathing in tune with the rhythm that had been awakened. Elric moved forward, drawn not by will, but by an unspoken pull, as if the very stones were calling to him. The monks had all gone into the woods, into the waiting silence of the trees. He knew they would not return, not the way they once had. What had begun long ago had reached its inevitable conclusion, and they had answered the call. His eyes drifted to the altar, to the empty space where the crucifix had once hung. Now, there was only the cold stone, smooth, empty. Even the symbol of the cross, the emblem of all they had served, had vanished from this place. The walls no longer whispered prayers, they only breathed. Slowly, he turned away from the altar and made his way to the back of the chapel, to the narrow passage that led to the deeper corridors. His steps felt heavy, weighted by a force he could not name. The doors at the far end of the hall opened without sound, and he stepped through, entering the familiar stone corridors. But the air was different now. The stillness was no longer simply a lack of noise. It was as if time itself had slowed, stretching out before him like an endless void. Every footstep echoed too loudly, too sharply, as if the very space around him was too wide, too empty, to contain him. Elric reached the stairs leading down, his hand brushing the cold stone as he descended. The lower crypt was darker now, more oppressive. It felt alive, vibrating with the subtle rhythm of something vast, something deep beneath the earth. The walls seemed to pulse in time with the distant heartbeat that had begun long ago, a heartbeat that resonated through the stone, through his bones, through his thoughts. When he reached the base of the stairwell, the monolith stood there, unchanged, but somehow more present than before. It pulsed with a light that was not of this world, soft, radiant, and unearthly. The symbols upon it glowed faintly, a slow rhythm that matched the beat of his heart. And there, beside it, lay the altar once more, the stone slab, the blood-stained basin, and the basin that had once been filled with something dark and otherworldly. It was empty now, but the shadows surrounding it moved, shifting in ways that defied logic. Elric's breath caught in his throat as he looked around the room. There were no monks, no figures kneeling in silent worship, only the monolith, only the altar, and in the center of the room, the figure, not floating now, but kneeling. The man whose body had once hung suspended in the crypt had moved, had shifted, his bare feet pressed against the cold stone floor, his body bent low, his hands resting on the edge of the altar. His eyes, once pure white, were now full of something Elric could not name. It was not human, not entirely. The figure turned its head toward him, and though its lips did not move, its voice filled the air. "You have returned." Elric froze. His heart pounded in his chest. "You were the last," the figure whispered. The last who could still hear the silence beneath. Elric's mind reeled. He wanted to run, but his body would not obey. The words, the presence, the overwhelming weight of something ancient, something that had waited for centuries, it held him there. The figure's hands curled into the stone of the altar, its fingers leaving deep marks in the surface as if the rock itself could not contain it. "The world has forgotten us," it said, "but we have never forgotten it." Elric's breath caught. "Who are you?" The figure straightened, its body shifting unnaturally, rising to its full height as it turned toward him. It was not human, not entirely. It was something older than man, something that had slept beneath the earth for millennia, something that had waited for the right moment to rise. "You were always meant to come," it said. "The monastery was built to keep the dream alive. The Watchers, they built it to keep us from awakening." Elric took a step back, his heart racing. "What are you?" he demanded. The figure's eyes glowed a pale, luminous blue, a color not of this world, and it smiled, though there was no warmth in its expression. "I am the dreamer," it said, "and you are the one who has woken me." Elric staggered backward, his mind trying to grasp the enormity of the truth he was being given. You've been waiting?" The figure nodded slowly. "Waiting to wake," it said softly, "but waiting to be remembered." The walls around them trembled, the pulse of the monolith growing louder, its rhythm now matching the beat of Elric's heart. The symbols upon the stone grew brighter, flaring with the force that pulled his eyes toward them. They sang not in sound, but in sensation. The air hummed, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to shift and sway, as if reality itself were bending. The silence was never ours, the figure said. It was never meant to be kept. Elric felt the pull of something deeper, the weight of centuries pressing down on him, urging him to kneel, to join the others who had answered the call. But he fought against it, his mind swirling with panic and disbelief. "No," he whispered. "I didn't come here to serve you." The figure tilted its head, its smile widening slightly. "You didn't come to serve," it said softly. "You came to remember." The ground beneath him quaked. "Now," the figure said, its voice a low murmur, "you will see what the Watchers tried to hide." And with that, the monolith flared bright, and the chamber seemed to collapse inward, the walls twisting and warping into the dark. Elric's eyes closed, and for the first time in his life, he understood. It felt like falling without moving. Elric's eyes were closed, yet light burst behind them, slow, deliberate pulses of color and thought that were not his own. His feet remained on stone, but the ground no longer belonged to this world. The hum that had lived in the corners of the monastery's silence now filled everything. The air, his limbs, the chambers of his heart. It was not sound, it was presence. He opened his eyes. He was no longer in the crypt, or perhaps he was, but it had changed, expanded, or reverted, or awakened into something that had always been there beneath the skin of the abbey. The stone walls were alive with movement, the symbols not merely glowing, but shifting, spinning in slow spirals, rising and curling like smoke made from light. Above him, the ceiling had vanished, replaced by a vast emptiness filled with stars he did not recognize. They pulsed with the same rhythm as the monolith, though there was no monolith now, only a hollow space where it had stood. And in that space, memory, not his, not any man's, but the earth's. He stood amidst visions, layers of time peeled back like pages of a great tome. He saw the land before the abbey, before men, before the word abbey had meaning. Vast forests, deep waters, the air thick with silence, and broken by voice or name. Beneath it all, the same rhythm, pulsing in the roots of trees, in the stones of mountains, in the marrow of the first beasts that crawled from the sea. He saw the first men, primitive, frightened, already forgetting. They built fires, drew shapes on walls, not for art, for warning. They had found it, even then, the wound beneath the land, the shape without shape, the dreamer. They did not know its name, only that to speak of it was to invite memory, and memory, once touched by it, grew teeth. He saw a village rise, a shrine, then a temple, then stone foundations atop that temple, laid by hands that had forgotten why they were building. And then, at last, the abbey, not to honor God, but to bury something no language could hold. The Watchers came next. They were not monks, not truly. They were custodians of a lie made sacred. They learned silence as a weapon. They learned prayer as a wall. But the dream pressed on. It seeped through cracks in the stone and in the mind. It whispered behind closed eyes, painting symbols on eyelids, shaping thoughts into spirals. The Watchers forgot, then remembered, then forgot again, and now Elric stood in the middle of it all, surrounded by the memory of a wound the world had been taught to ignore. "You see it now," came the voice. He turned slowly. The figure stood at the edge of the circle, robes of shifting shadow wrapped loosely around a body made of suggestion more than substance. Its eyes glowed not with light, but with recognition, as though it saw not Elric, but all those who had stood in his place before. "You are part of the forgetting," it said softly, "and part of the return." Elric opened his mouth to speak, but his voice failed. The figure stepped forward. I was not buried by force, it said. I chose the silence. I gave it freely, so the world might grow in peace. Elric frowned. Mind swimming. You gave up memory? Yes, the dreamer said. To give you time. Elric's heart pounded. Then why awaken now? The figure knelt beside the space where the monolith had stood. Because the silence has ended, it whispered, and the dream has turned. All around them, the visions flickered faster. The abbey, once crumbling and quiet, now teemed with movement. Monks chanting, cymbals pulsing, doors opening, children drawn to hidden chambers. Entire generations raised in shadowed worship, unaware of what they served. And then the unraveling voices braved, rules bended, silence cragger. Elric saw himself kneeling before the monolith. Not once, but many times. Over and over. As if he had always been there. As if time bent backward and forward around this moment. He staggered. The dreamer touched his shoulder gently. You are not a man, it said. You are a vessel, a repetition, a remembering. Elric shook his head, tears stinging his eyes. No, I'm real. Yes, the voice replied. But not only once. He dropped to his knees, the full weight of memory bearing down like a tide. He saw himself in different robes, different faces, always here, always waking, always forgetting. The dream had needed him, and he had always come. He looked up into the dreamer's eyes. Then what am I to do? The figure stood, folding the light around it. Now, you must choose. The walls began to hum louder, the stars above flickering. The abbey beyond was crumbling, stones falling, windows shattering, the forest twisting as if remembering its own ancient root beneath the soil. What choice? To let the dream end, the voice said. Elric rose slowly. And if I don't? Then it continues, the dreamer whispered. The silence, the forgetting, the suffering. And if I do? The chamber quaked. Then the world remembers. He stared at the empty basin where blood had once pooled. He remembered the monks, walking into the woods, not fleeing. Returning. To the earth. To the root. To the wound. He placed his hands on the altar. The stone was warm. The spirals glowed faintly beneath his skin. Above, the stars began to shift. Realignment, reawakening. He closed his eyes, and he spoke the name. With voice, but with memory. With the language beneath thought. The dream shuddered, and then everything went quiet. Not still, empty, just quiet. Not the silence of suppression, but the stillness of release. He opened his eyes. The chamber was gone. The abbey was gone. He stood in a field of frost-kissed grass beneath a sky without shape. The stars above blinked slowly. The earth below no longer hummed. It breathed. And Elric understood. The dream had ended, not with violence, but with knowing, and in its place clarity. The long forgetting had lifted, and in the silence left behind, something new began. The frost beneath his feet was soft, like morning mist clinging to blades of grass, though the ground itself no longer felt real. The sky above him was vast, colorless, neither day nor night, as if the rhythm of time had paused to allow a thought to form. Elric stood in the stillness, no longer sure if he was awake or dreaming, living or remembering, existing or dissolving into something older than all of those things combined. The silence was unlike any before. It didn't press, it didn't smother, it simply was. The kind of silence that follows an answer so vast, so ancient, that the question it responds to no longer matters. He turned slowly. There was no abbey behind him now, no chapel, no cloisters, only a flat plain that stretched to the edge of knowing. And there, rising in the distance, was the shape of a tree. Not large, not towering, just present. Its branches curved skyward as though reaching for something it could no longer recall. He began to walk. Each step felt weightless, though he could feel the earth beneath him respond, as if it remembered him, each footfall stirring memories buried beneath soil and stone. He had walked this way before, in another life, in another form. The path itself had not changed, only he had. The tree came closer. Its bark was not bark. Its trunk was not wood. It shimmered slightly, like stone wrapped in memory. And the roots, dug not into soil, but into everything, spreading in directions beyond time and space. At its base, a small pool, still water, perfectly smooth, reflecting not the tree above, but the stars. And in those stars, he saw faces. Not human, not monstrous, simply watchers, silent, endless, waiting. The same faces he had seen carved into ancient stone, worn smooth by wind and ritual. The same shapes the monks had seen in dreams and etched unknowingly into manuscript margins. The same presence that had lingered in the crypt, beneath the monolith, beneath the memory of faith. He knelt beside the pool. His reflection did not look back. Instead, he saw a boy himself, younger, freshly robed, standing beneath the winter sun outside the Abbey gates. That boy had known so little, had feared so deeply, had trusted the silence. Then the image shifted. He saw the monks, each of them kneeling in circles, drawn by a call they did not understand. Not victims, not possessed, witnesses, carriers of memory passed down like breath through stone corridors. They had never prayed to God. They had contained something deeper, and now, that containment had ended. Elric reached forward and touched the water. It rippled, and then the landscape changed again. He was walking the corridors of the monastery once more, but not as they had been, much older. The stone was darker, the torches dimmer, the scent of age so thick it clung to the air like fog. The brothers who passed him were not familiar, yet he knew them. Echoes, reverberations of those who had come before, each one caught in the endless pattern of worship and forgetting. At the far end of the hallway stood the abbot. Not the one he had known. Not quite. This one was taller, thinner, eyes pale and blank, like the figure in the crypt. "You returned," the abbot said. Elric nodded. "Was I supposed to?" The abbot stepped aside, revealing a large doorway one Elric had never seen before. "It is time," the abbot said, "for the last liturgy." He passed through the doorway. The chamber beyond was vast, circular, stone walls layered with spiraling symbols, moving now, breathing. The ceiling above was domed and open to a sky without clouds. At its center, another monolith, but this one cracked, broken down the middle, bleeding faint light. The monks stood in perfect rows around it, chanting softly, in a language Elric had never learned, yet somehow understood. Each word was not a word, but a memory. Each phrase, a truth long buried. He stepped into the circle. The chanting stopped. The monks turned to face him, their eyes wide, unblinking, and they bowed. He felt no triumph, no fear, only a deep, aching understanding. He had become what they had always been, the vessel, the seal, the one who would remember and then forget. The dreamer had not been a being, not a monster or a spirit or a demon. It had been them, all of them, their collective memory buried beneath generations of silence, twisted by ritual into something they no longer recognized. The Watchers had not contained something evil, they had contained truth, and truth, when forgotten, rots. The abbot approached him and held out an object wrapped in cloth. Elric unwrapped it, a stone mask, smooth, featureless, shaped like a face forgotten by time. He held it in his hands, its weight familiar. He had worn this before, many times. He placed it over his face, and the chanting resumed, the final liturgy, but it was not an end yet. He felt the pulse rise again through the stone, through the air, through the memory of the monastery, now burned into the world itself. He saw the abbey collapse inward, not into ruin, into origin. The walls returned to earth, the chapel folded into sky, the crypts dissolved into soil, and only the pulse remained, not buried, but remembered. And from that memory, something new began to grow, not of branches and bark, but of silence and truth. The stone mask clung to his face like it had always belonged there. It did not obscure his vision, it changed it. Through its smooth, eyeless shape, Elric could see more clearly than he ever had, not with eyes, but with memory, not with light, but with resonance. The world was no longer stone and wood and frost. It was echoes. Each footstep rang with the weight of centuries. Each breath stirred a chain of thoughts unspoken since the first hand pressed ink to vellum in the name of a god who was never meant to answer. The chanting behind him faded, not because it ended, because it passed through him. He was part of it now, a monk. Not a man, but a thread in the long weave of memory, pulled taut across centuries of silence. As he turned, the figures that surrounded him bowed once more, and then dissolved, not like mist, but like candle smoke, rising toward the stars that glowed without sky. He walked from the circle alone, but never alone again. He stepped into a corridor that had no walls, only impressions, passages made not of stone, but of remembered stone. He passed alcoves holding relics he had never seen before, yet somehow recognized: a black feather sealed in wax, a cup filled with ash, a scroll written entirely in red ink, its words alive and shifting. Each object hummed with a single truth: "We remembered you." He reached a chamber shaped like an hourglass. Inside, time bent visibly, moments slipping downward in spirals, collecting at the base like grains of sand, made from thought. He walked through without resistance. The spirals followed him now, not carved, not glowing, but alive. They wrapped around his fingers like vines. They slid across his robes like drifting ink. They pressed gently into his thoughts, not to change them, but to settle beside them, old friends returning home. He emerged into what looked like the old refectory, but it was no longer abandoned, no longer dim. It was full of light, not bright. True. At the long table sat the monks, not robed, not human in shape anymore, but still then. Each form shimmered faintly, made of memory and echo and purpose. They turned to him, not as a visitor, not as a stranger, but as one of their own, one who had forgotten and returned, one who had awakened to the depth beneath the prayer, beneath the vow, beneath the silence. The abbot stood at the head of the table. His voice came not from his mouth, but from the walls, from the floor, from the space between things. "You see clearly now." Elric nodded, the mask still resting gently on his face. "I see everything." The abbot extended a hand, and in it, a book. But it was not a book. It had no pages. And no cover, only a shape made of knowing. Elric reached for it, and as his hand passed into the object, it poured through him like light through glass, filling him, not with information, but with purpose. The monks stood, one by one. They dissolved, not into death, but into becoming. They faded into the walls, into the corridors, into the very silence of the monastery, and Elric was alone once more, but no longer separate. He stepped outside. The snow had returned, but it no longer fell. It rose flakes drifting upward toward the skies as dark, caught in a slow unraveling of gravity. The forest beyond the monastery stretched wider than before, the trees taller, older. They watched now, not as observers, but as kin. The roots remembered him. The leaves whispered his name, not the name given at birth, but the one carried in silence across 1,000 generations. He walked toward the woods, not to flee. To return. At the forest's edge, he found the others, the monks, kneeling, eyes closed, faces lifted to the sky. They were not changed, they were remembered, each one shimmering faintly, each one pulsing with the rhythm he now carried within. Elric stepped into their circle. No one spoke. No one needed to. The ground beneath them stirred, not shaken, not cracked, but breathed. The soil rose gently, forming a low mound at the center of the circle, and from it, the tree, not the one he had seen before, a new one, or perhaps the same one, beginning again. Its bark glistened like wet ink, its leaves curled like parchment, each branch spiraled upward in patient, perfect arcs. The monks stood. Together, they walked forward and placed their hands on the trunk. Elric followed. When his fingers touched the tree, he felt it all at once. Every vow, every chant, every night passed in solitude, every moment of forgetting, every return. The abbey had never been built to keep something in. It had been built to give the dream shape. To allow memory to walk, to pray, to sleep. And now, at last, it no longer needed walls. The silence was whole again, not broken, not cracked, complete. He knelt before the tree, not in worship, but in stillness. The monks around him did the same. The stars flickered, the wind passed gently through the leaves, and for the first time in countless generations, the silence dreamed back. The tree grew slowly, not in size, but in presence. Each day, or what felt like a day, a new spiral formed in its bark, a new curl of branch unfurled toward the night sky, where no sun rose and no stars remained fixed. The monks, still silent, still kneeling in patient rhythm, did not age. They did not hunger. They did not move unless memory itself shifted within them. Elric sat among them, not as their leader, not as their equal. As a page between two books. He had not spoken in what felt like years. There was no longer any need. The silence had matured. It no longer waited, it taught. The ground beneath him pulsed softly, not like a heartbeat, but like a breath taken slowly over the span of centuries. The roots of the tree brushed against his feet from beneath the soil, curling gently, a touch of recognition more intimate than language. He could feel the monastery far behind them, crumbled entirely, now returned to the shape it had always longed for. Earth, stone, memory. The bell tower had fallen last, not in violence, but in grace. A final release. The iron bell, too, was gone, not rusted, absorbed, melted into the marrow of the land. Everything was quiet, not empty. Full. In the new stillness, Elric began to see, not with eyes, those he rarely used now, but with memory. He saw the children who would one day walk this soil, eyes open to a world not of punishment or penance, but of quiet understanding. They would not call it religion. They would not name the tree, but they would sit beneath it, and they would feel something shift within them, something ancient, something patient. They would not need to know why. They would only need to remember how it felt. One evening, if such a thing still existed, Godric returned. Not walk, not aged. He simply was, appearing at the edge of the circle, where memory met boundary. Elric rose to meet him. He said nothing. Godric only smiled, a smile not of joy or sorrow, but of recognition. "You look well," he said, though his voice was barely more than breath. Elric nodded. "You returned," he said. Godric looked up at the tree. "I never really left." The silence between them was gentle, not strained, not heavy, just full. "Remember now," Elric said. Godric closed his eyes. "That's all we ever wanted." They sat beside the tree together, hands resting on the soil, and the tree responded. Its branches lowered slightly, casting shadows shaped like words never spoken aloud. Godric sighed. "I once believed the monastery was meant to protect something, that we were wardens of a secret." "We were," Elric said, "but not in the way we thought," Godric whispered. The silence pulsed in agreement. "We weren't protecting the world from the dream," Elric murmured. "We were protecting the dream from the world." Godric nodded. "Because the world wasn't ready." A long pause. "And now?" Elric asked. The roots shifted gently beneath them. "You made it ready." That night, Elric dreamt again, but this time, he did not descend into crypts or kneel before glowing monoliths. He did not see symbols spinning in ancient stone. He walked through a field of flowers, soft and luminous, each one humming with a soundless melody. The sky was pale, and the sun, though distant, pulsed in time with his breath. He came to a hill, where a small group of children sat in a circle. None of them spoke. One of them pointed upward. In the sky above, not a star but a spiral, not light, but memory, and each child reached upward. Not to grasp it, but to let it touch them. Elric awoke. Slowly, the world was the same, still, breathing. The monks were stirring now, rising, not leaving, simply shifting. The silence had begun to spread beyond them, into the trees, into the soil, into the birds that sang without echo. And beyond the woods, the first travelers had begun to appear, wanderers, pilgrims, dreamers, not by design, drawn. They came not seeking salvation, but something they could not name. They did not bring relics, only questions, and when they arrived, they did not speak. They knelt, not before the monks, not before the tree, before the silence, and the silence accepted them. Elric watched this in stillness. He did not guide them. He did not teach. He only remembered. Each new soul brought with them a fragment of the world's great forgetting, and the silence absorbed it, gently, slowly, a great, soft tide pulling the weight from their shoulders, and in return, it gave them stillness, not peace, not yet, but stillness, the beginning of it, and slowly, very slowly, the dream that had once been buried beneath stone, and ritual, and fear began to live again, not as horror, not as burden, but as truth. And truth, at last, had learned how to rest. The seasons no longer passed as they once had. There were no calendars, no bells to mark the hour, no fasts to be broken or vigils to be held. But change still came, in subtle ways, in the way the air carried itself differently at dawn, in the tilt of the spiraling branches above them, in the weight of footsteps across the clearing where the tree now stood tall and full. Elric had not spoken in years, nor had he needed to. When he opened his eyes each morning, if morning was the right word, he saw the same faces gathered in the same circle, some new, some old, some that shimmered faintly, like breath on glass, others made of flesh and memory both. The monks no longer aged, or perhaps they had shed age entirely. Their bodies remained, but without hunger, without pain, without end. And people came, not in pilgrimage, but in silence, drawn not by rumor or relic, but by something older than curiosity. Some came weeping, though they did not know why. Others laughed quietly, or walked barefoot through the tall grass as if they had returned to a place they once dreamed of as children. The tree welcomed them all. It did not judge. It did not speak. It only remembered, and in its remembering, it allowed others to forget. Not everything, just the weight. Elric now spent most of his days at the base of the tree, where the soil was warm and soft, and where the roots gently pulsed against his spine at the slow heartbeat of the earth itself. He no longer thought in words. He thought in shapes, in spirals, in stillness. His memories no longer belonged to him alone. They had folded themselves into the dream. He was not a man. He was a seam, a stitch between the age of silence and the age to come. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he saw the abbey again, not as it had fallen, but as it once stood. The cold stone cloisters, the high chapel ceilings, the whisper of robes brushing across frozen flagstones at dawn. He saw the scriptorium, the dormitory, the hidden passages beneath the altar, but none of it brought sorrow. The abbey had done its work. It had kept the silence alive long enough to let it remember itself. Now, there was no need for walls, only breath. One day, a child arrived. He came alone, barefoot, no older than 10. His face was calm. His clothes were torn. He said nothing, only walked through the trees, past the silent figures, toward the base of the tree. And there he sat, cross-legged, opposite Elric, who opened his eyes and watched him. They stared at one another. Neither smiled, neither spoke. The tree shivered slightly above them. A single leaf fell, landing between them on the soil. The child reached out and picked it up. He studied the spiral traced faintly on its surface, natural, perfect. He did not look confused, only still. And in that moment, Elric knew. The silence had chosen. The next, remembering, had already begun. The child was not special, not chosen, only ready, and in this place, that was all that mattered. The monks began to gather in the outer ring of the clearing, some standing, some kneeling, none speaking. The newcomers, to those who had arrived in recent seasons, whose minds still carried echoes of the world beyond, stood among them, waiting, witnessing. Elric placed his hand on the soil and felt the roots respond. The tree pulsed once, the air shimmered faintly, and then, gently, a ring of light bloomed around the child, rising like morning mist from the earth, curling into soft spirals that wrapped around his hands, his face, his shoulders. Not to claim him. To remember him. Elric bowed his head. The monks did the same, and the silence deepened. An O light flared. An O miracle stirred. Only the presence of something ancient and complete folding itself into one more life. The dream did not need guardians now, only witnesses, and the world beyond had begun to feel the change. Reports from distant towns spoke of quiet dreams, of strange symbols appearing in frost on window panes, of children humming melodies they could not name, of old men waking from sleep weeping softly, whispering the name of a monastery no map could find. There was no need to explain it. The age of explanation was ending. The dream had rooted itself again. This time, in stone, but in people, and through them, the silence grew. Each new visitor who knelt beside the tree carried the memory outward when they left, not in words or images, but in quietness. They spoke less, slept more deeply, listened longer, and where they went, others followed, not to worship. To remember. In time, Elric grew still, not in body. In presence, he faded, not into death, but into the earth. The spirals of his thoughts melted into the soil, fed the roots, curled around the trunk. The monks did not mourn, they only watched, and when the wind passed through the tree that evening, it carried his breath with it, not gone, dispersed, returned, and in his place, others sat, some older, some younger. None asked for answers. The silence gave them all they needed. At the edge of the woods, a new figure approached, another child, eyes open, barefoot, drawn by the spiral without knowing why, and the tree waited, and the silence watched, and the dream, now fully awake, curled deeper into the world, not to speak, not to rule, not to demand, only to be. And in its being, it offered something the old world had long forgotten. Not salvation, not redemption, stillness. And that was enough. The forest had changed, not in shape or color or sound, but in something deeper, in the way it stood, the way it breathed, the way the air within it no longer belonged entirely to the present. People still arrived, though none followed roads. Roads, after all, were for destinations, but the tree, and the silence beneath it, was not a destination. It was a return. A soft return to something the world had forgotten, perhaps on purpose. The child who had sat across from Elric still came. Each day, years passed in a way no one measured anymore. He did not grow fast, but he changed. The way he walked, the way he touched the tree with the palm of his hand each morning, not asking anything of it, just greeting it the way one greets the sun without thought. His name was never spoken aloud. No one needed to ask. In this place, names had no power. Only presence did. He sat in the circle now with the others, still and quiet, eyes always watching, not like a leader, not like a servant, just watching, like the tree watched, like the monks had once watched. One evening, just before the sky dimmed into the soft ash-colored glow that marked the closing of each long day, something new arrived. Not a child, not a wanderer, a woman. She came barefoot like the others, but her steps were slow, measured, as if she were stepping not on soil, but across thresholds. Her eyes were clear. She carried nothing in her hands. No book, no token, no offering. Only silence. The monks turned to look, not as gatekeepers, but as witnesses. Their robes moved like breath. A few of the youngest among them stepped back as the woman passed, not out of fear, out of reverence. The boy stood to meet her, and when they faced one another beneath the branches of the spiral tree, something old stirred in the wind, not words, not prophecy, a remembering. The woman reached up and touched a low-hanging branch. The leaves curled gently around her fingers, not like a plant responding to warmth, but like memory curling back into its keeper. She looked at the boy. "You remember," she said softly. The boy nodded. "I remember enough." She smiled. It was not a joyful smile. It was the kind of smile worn by someone who had wandered through many dreams, none of which were truly her own. Then she knelt beside the tree, as the monks had done, as the pilgrims had done, as Elric had once done before becoming part of the earth. The tree bowed slightly above her. It had never done that before. The child watched, and behind him, the air shimmered not with light, not with sound, but with stillness drawn so tight it trembled. The forest held its breath. Something in the soil shifted, not violently, more like a page being turned. The monks did not speak. They rose, one by one. They stood, and their silence was no longer just habit, it was language, and in that silence, a message passed between them all. It was time, not to end, not to leave, but to begin again. The spiral had turned far enough. It had reached the outer edge, and now, gently, it would curve inward once more. The woman stood. So did the child. She looked up at the tree, then at the monks, then beyond them all toward the space where once the abbey had stood. Only grass grew there now. No stone, no memory of walls, just a clearing, untouched. She began to walk toward it. The boy followed. The monks moved in quiet procession behind them, not to lead, not to follow, but to witness. When they reached the clearing, the woman paused. This was where it was built, she said. The child nodded. the place of forgetting. He tilted her head. Do you know what came before it? The child closed his eyes, and for a long moment, the wind itself seemed to stop. Then he said, "A garden," and the silence trembled. With recognition, she knelt in the center of the clearing and pressed her hands to the earth. The monks gathered in a circle. The tree in the distance pulsed faintly, its spirals glowing in time with her breath. From her fingertips, warmth spread, and from that warmth, something green. Small shoots, leaves, flowers shaped like spirals, blooming not outward, but inward, curling delicately toward the earth. The monk sat down around her. The child placed his hands beside hers, and the first new garden took root. And prayers were spoken. And books were opened. And relics placed on stone altars. Only the silence remained, and in that silence, something deeper than holiness, balance. This was what had been lost, not to sin, to time. To noise. The monks remained for a long time, surrounding the clearing like stones around a spring. And as the garden grew, others arrived, not to see, not to touch, but to sit quietly nearby, to watch, to feel the shift in the air. They came from cities, from farms, from places where the dream had left long ago. And in the curve of each leaf, in the breath of the soil, in the way the boy and the woman never spoke, but always understood, they began to feel it again. Not the memory of God, but the memory of peace. Elric, now long gone from flesh, was not absent. He was the soil, the roots, the curve of each flower petal. And as the silence stretched its arms across the land, reaching beyond the monastery ruins, beyond the edges of the woods, into the towns and valleys and hills of the old world, something else began to happen. Not loudly, not all at once, but gently. People slowed, spoke less, listened more, and the world, so long afraid of its own stillness, began to rest, not as punishment, but as homecoming. There was no final sermon, no last revelation. The silence did not crescendo or break. It simply deepened like dusk slipping into night without ceremony. The garden grew slowly at the edge of the ruins, curling itself into the memory of what once stood there. Wildflowers whispered along old foundations. Spiral-shaped leaves traced unseen paths through the grass. The woman remained. The child did too. Not as figures to be followed, not as saints or seers. They sat in the garden each day as it grew around them, neither guarding it nor tending it, only sharing its stillness with those who came. And they did come, not in crowds. And moments, one soul at a time, drawn from the noise of the world into something wordless. They arrived with burdens too heavy to name, and left with none of them resolved, yet lighter all the same. The garden didn't erase suffering, it simply remembered what existed underneath it. Peace without answers, rest without reason, truth without telling. The monks, fewer now, still circled the place where the tree stood, though many had wandered outward, not to preach, not to teach, only to carry the stillness with them like breath, like warmth held between palms. They walked through villages and marketplaces like shadows of the old order, unrobed, unnamed. And where they paused, others grew quieter. Something in their eyes, something familiar, though no one could say why. And beyond them, the world began to shift. Not in the way kings fall or empires change names. In the deeper ways. Conversations slowed. Fewer. Cathedrals rose. Books were written not to convince, but to remember. Children no longer flinched at silence, and when the wind passed through town squares and alleyways, it carried no scripture, only calm. The garden bloomed wider, not in borders or walls, but in reach, spreading through dreams and breath, through memory and soil. People dreamed of it who had never been there. They saw the spiral leaves, the soft light, the boy and the woman sitting beneath the great tree. And when they woke, they could still feel it, a place where forgetting had ended, where the dream was no longer hidden, no longer dangerous, where it had learned to live quietly within them. Some called it a miracle, others called it madness, but the ones who knew, they said nothing, because there was nothing left to prove. One evening, the boy rose. The woman remained in the garden, her hands buried in the earth, eyes closed as if listening to the roots speak in a voice no language could hold. The boy walked toward the spiral tree. He had not been there in many seasons. Its branches were broader now, its trunk thick with the memory of names no longer needed. He placed his palm against the bark, and it was warm. The spirals on its surface pulsed softly, responding, and then a single fruit, just one, fell, round, dark, smooth. He caught it in his hands. He did not eat it. He did not offer it to anyone. He carried it back to the garden and set it in the center of the clearing, among the spiral flowers, and he wept, not from grief, from understanding, because the dream was done, not gone, complete. That night, the tree shed its leaves in silence, each one curled in perfect spirals, falling slowly to the earth like snow. The monks gathered them, not to preserve them, not to honor them, but to let them fall. To witness, and in the morning, the branches were bare. The monks bowed their heads. The boy and the woman stood together for the last time, and then they parted. He walked north, toward lands untouched by memory. She walked south, toward cities that had never slept. Neither turned to look back. They did not need to, because the silence was no longer kept in gardens or cloisters. It had grown past them. It lived in every breath where someone paused before speaking. It lived in every glance exchanged between strangers on quiet streets. It lived in the space between prayer and thought. It lived in the soil. It lived in the wind. And long after the garden folded into wildness, long after the spiral tree fell and returned to earth, long after the last monk faded into the crowd of the world, the silence remained, patient, soft, whole, and wherever it was felt, even for a moment, the world remembered. Not everything, just enough.